the Soviet bloc and the American-led bloc, sought further and further economic and social integration and tended towards the UN,
Mhm.
the IMF, the World Bank. Bizarrely, when the Soviet Union is defeated, no new institutions of order are created. We don't have post Cold War global institutions, say a new kind of NATO or a new kind of World Bank, which was about bringing the Soviet countries into the global economic system. We don't have that.
This is Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading episode 187 for the 16th of April 2026. We try to cover stuff on this podcast that's undercovered in other media. And then we got the fuel protests. I don't want to talk about tax dodging and other convictions. There's been a huge amount of talk about whether the protests are or are influenced by or are infiltrated by the far right, as well as about whether the left does or should support the protests. So I'm not going to talk about that. And there's been a lot of talk about whether farmers are or should be subsidised by the rest of society. So I don't want to talk about that either. What I want to talk about first is divisions in Irish society that we really don't talk about so much. I could talk about an urban-rural divide. I think that is under-discussed. But the problem is that we really don't have an urban-rural divide in Ireland. We have more of a sliding scale. The proliferation of one-off houses has changed what is technically countryside in places near and not so near our cities. It's changed them into continuous lines of road-facing development. The further you go, the more this thins out, so there isn't really a clear dividing line between what is urban and what is rural, but there are certainly differences, and just because you can't always identify the boundary between the two, it doesn't mean that you can't talk about the difference between the man and the boy, or the difference between the culchie and the jackeen. One of those differences that the protesters brought up was how much more rural people are dependent on their own transport, that's to say cars, than people in urban areas. The increase in fuel costs hit them directly and instantly and hard. They can't avoid driving to get their shopping, driving their children to school and so on. They don't have these services within walking distance, and the taxpayer doesn't provide them with Lewis and Dart and frequent bus services. It's just not fair on them. And that's true. Except when it's not true. People make decisions. And those decisions have consequences. They can avoid driving to the supermarket or to the school. They can move house if they want to. People live in rural or urban areas, and each of those have their costs and benefits, and people make decisions based on those costs and benefits. One of those consequences of living in rural areas is that transport is much more expensive and exposed to fuel price shocks, and there's just far less public transport. One of the consequences of living in urban areas is that you'll pay far more for housing and you'll usually get far less. Housing is a market, and market prices reflect demand. So I would say that, roughly speaking, those lower rural housing costs balance the other higher costs when combined with how many people prefer the rural or urban lifestyle. Or they would balance them if all those costs fell on the decision maker. But a lot of the costs of living in rural Ireland aren't paid by rural dwellers. The cost of delivering services like post, telephone, internet and electricity to rural areas are far higher, but for the most part, the prices are fixed in law to be the same as for urban areas, meaning that when urban dwellers pay for those services, the prices they pay internalise a big subsidy for rural dwellers. You can argue whether that's justified or not, but you can't argue that it's not true. And that's only the start. A few years back, David McWilliams wrote about the vast imbalance between the tax and spending in Dublin compared to the rest of the country. He said Dublin has 38% of the country's population, but it accounts for 61% of VAT receipts, 52% of employment taxes, 45% of self-employment tax, 62% of corporation tax receipts, and 43% of capital gains tax receipts. While Dublin generates €22 billion in revenue, only 16 billion of that is spent in Dublin. That was a €6 billion difference in 2018 figures, working out at a transfer to the rest of the country of about €3,000 from every man, woman and child in the capital. £3,000 each. Remember that when you hear somebody cribbing that we never get anything. And remember that when you see protesters demanding a cut on fuel taxes, possibly the only tax that reverses that imbalance slightly. And that brings me to the protests themselves. I talked a while back about how well Ireland does in a whole range of international indices, the Index on Democracy, GDP, Quality of Life, Child and Maternal Mortality, and many others. It's actually shocking how well Ireland performs. And I found another index this week, and it's from an organisation called Civicus. They say that their mission is to strengthen citizen action and civil society throughout the world, and they produce a score for how open civic space is in every country, basically how easy it is to protest and campaign. And it's good to see that Ireland does very well. Ireland scores 89 out of 100 and comes 12th out of 199 nations, which actually understates how well we do. Most of the countries in the top 10 are actually microstates like San Marino and Liechtenstein. So less than 1/6 of 1%, less than 1/6 of 1% of the world's population live in countries that score better than Ireland. And I think that's great. It's great that people, whether I agree with them or not, can strike and march and petition and protest to campaign for whatever they want. That's great, as long as everyone can do it, and as long as everyone can do it equally. But there are some people out there who, by virtue of their profession, have access to equipment that allows them to cause far more disruption to society in general than most of us. I'm talking, of course, about using tractors and other farm equipment to blockade other people's businesses and roads that we all own. I'm also talking about the so-called strikes by taxi drivers a few years back, where they all parked their taxis in the middle of city streets, completely blocking them for trams, buses and other cars. Working in a job that gives you access to this equipment, tractors, taxis or whatever, that doesn't give you a right to use it to hold the rest of society hostage, and it certainly doesn't give you a right to have your views take precedence over those of people who don't have access to that equipment. If the Bricklayers Union built a wall across the M50, if childcare workers had their kindergartners lie down blocking access to transport or infrastructure, if supermarket workers dumped all the produce supposed to be on sale on roads or anywhere that cut off other people's access to supplies or to their workplace, they would all pretty soon be out of a job and likely into a prison cell. That law should apply to all, and tractors, taxis, or other equipment used to break the law should be confiscated on the spot. I talked on the last podcast about the importance of having taxation spread broadly across the economy with careful thought put into tax incentives which are designed to influence behaviour. How exactly that is done is obviously one of the most important debates in civic space, and everyone has their right to be heard. And people's voices should be heard equally, not in proportion to the degree that they can hold the rest of society to ransom. In a moment, we'll have the interview, but first I want to say thanks to all of the patrons on Patreon. I really appreciate everyone who donates on Patreon. We don't get a huge amount of money out of it. It's not like some of the big league podcasts that you've probably heard of, but it pays for things like web hosting, and Kevin and myself basically donate our time for free. And it's a big morale booster when we get a new patron. It lets us know that there are people out there who listen and appreciate the podcast. As I said at the top, we make an effort to cover things that are undercovered in other Irish media. You're more than welcome to listen for free, but if you think that you could do the same as those donors and throw in the price of a cup of coffee once or twice a month, there's details how to do that on the website and at the end of the show.
Do you agree? Do you disagree? Follow at Here's How Podcast on Twitter and like Here's How on Facebook for updates on each show's contents.
On the line now, I have Jason Pack. He is the host of a podcast called Disorder. He's also the founder of a consultancy called Libya-Analysis. He's an associate fellow with the Royal United Services Institute. He's a senior analyst for emerging challenges at the NATO Defence College Foundation in Rome. Jason, you specialise in Libya, and I'm sure many people in Ireland are familiar with Colonel Gaddafi, who supplied Semtex and arms to the Provisional IRA in the 1980s. He was deposed and captured and lynched in 2011. And ever since then, Libya has essentially been, I would say, a failed state with competing armed groups in different areas of the country. And they're competing for power and obviously for the oil wealth as well. Is that a good summary of how Libya has been in the past 15 years?
Sadly, I think it's all too accurate. Since the successful NATO no-fly zone supporting the rebels to overthrow Colonel Gaddafi in 2011, the country experienced 2 years of relative stability and oil production and economic growth returned. However, tensions, for example, paying off those who pretended to be part of militias and giving salaries to everyone, and what I call Libya's semi-sovereign institutions, those were problems bubbling underneath the surface. Subsidies, for example, in Libya, a liter of petrol is less than 1 euro cent. And this is
so we'll go back, it's less than 1 cent.
1 euro cent, yes. It's the cheapest in the world. But so all of those structures were leading towards instability and militia membership, even in the good years, 2012 and 2013. In 2014, we have the first war of post-Gaddafi succession, which pits not only the East against the West, but a kind of Islamist grouping against an anti-Islamist grouping, and Misrata on the one side and Benghazi on the other.
These are the two major cities on either end of the country.
Those are two of the three major cities.
Yeah.
And that war and militia violence died down by 2015, but it was always a tense stalemate. You had the rise of the Islamic State in Derna in the east, which is nearer to Egypt. And then when it was evicted from Derna, it camped out in Sirte, and it required yet another American-led air campaign to dislodge the Islamic State from Sirte. And as in 2011, the West was interested in kinetic military operations, but not in reconstruction. So an opportunity was lost to, help reform the Libyan economy, tackle corruption, things of this nature. And in 2019-2020, we have another round of civil war, the second war of post-Gaddafi succession. And this pits the rogue General Haftar, backed by Russia, the UAE, and bizarrely also France, against the government of national unity in Tripoli, backed by the US, UK, Italy, Turkey, and Qatar. And fascinatingly, despite the victory of the Turkish and Western-backed side, the debts of the East are subsumed. And that mistake of paying for the Eastern warlord has led to every sort of corruption and mistake. So we're in a situation now where the two parts of Libya are essentially separate countries with separate economic systems, separate foreign backers, and in a way, more so than in Somalia or Sudan or Syria, we have de facto bifurcation on the ground in Libya.
Okay. And there may be some people in Ireland who have somewhat of a romantic memory of Colonel Gaddafi. I mentioned he supported the Provisional IRA. He also, I think, supported anyone who he thought would be provide problems or resistance to Western governments that he didn't like. The Libyan embassy in London was closed under very controversial circumstances after apparently somebody there who had diplomatic immunity murdered the police officer Yvonne Fletcher. It is somewhat controversial, but I think it is believed that Gaddafi was responsible for the Lockerbie bombing, where a US airliner landed on the Scottish village of Lockerbie, with causing many deaths. However terrible Gaddafi was, is it maybe the case that he was a strong man that kept a lid on a country that just has so many internal contradictions that it's very difficult to see how you can have a peaceful government? Is that a bit of Orientalism on my part? Is that possibly true, or is there any other model under which Libya could be in any way peaceful and democratic, or even just peaceful?
I'd like to break this really important question into three parts.
Mm-hmm.
The one is, how bad was Gaddafi? What was his regime like? The second is Gaddafi and Britain, terrorism in Ireland.
Mm-hmm.
The third part is, can Libya be governed other than by a strongman? I think that it is Orientalist and inappropriate to say that any country is quote unquote not ready for democracy. And Libyans are as ready for democracy as any country that has never experienced democracy. They have high human capital. Many of them are educated abroad. The level of English is increasing every year. They're very tech savvy. And I think that in a world where you didn't have octogenarians running Libya with corrupt incentive structures, the quote unquote Libyan people would be as capable for democracy as the Lebanese, Iranians, Rwandans, anyone. And therefore it's inappropriate to say that Libyans are not ready for democracy. Libya actually is blessed in that it does not have sectarian and ethnic fissures. It's a 90+% Sunni Arab country. It doesn't have a history of civil war or conflict like Lebanon or Iraq. And there was every reason in 2011 to think that the transition might be very successful, certainly because of all the money that could be used for that transition. Why things have gone wrong, I would argue, has to do with economic incentive structures. And I write about that in my book, Libya and the Global Enduring Disorder, and many of the think tank reports I've published. If you have a system that subsidizes petrol, as we mentioned, subsidizes electricity, hives off different part of the economy in a very Soviet or post-Soviet Putinist style, it creates oligarchs, it creates incentive structures. If you, for example, can have access to dollars at below the correct exchange rate, well, that creates the incentive to be close to the central bank governor who issues those letters of credit, so that things have spiraled out of control into corruption and militias. I don't think is about Libyan culture, but is about the incorrect economic incentive structures that were baked in during the Gaddafi period and never reformed post-Gaddafi. We didn't really have a revolution in Libya in 2011. We had an uprising, but all of the corrupt and absurd, for lack of a better term, Soviet-style economic structures were left in place, and they lead to incentive structures for state capture. So that answers that question.
By state capture, just for the audience, you mean that theoretically private individuals and private businesses have such an influence over the government that they can run as though they were nationalized industries but for private benefit?
Something like that. In Libya, it's, again, more complicated. Libya is the epitome of what is called the semi-sovereign institution. So the central bank, the National Oil Corporation, the electricity monopoly, something called the Office for Development of Administrative Centers, which is a kind of corrupt housing building entity. These are all entirely independent and different oligarchic networks control them, and they might have hundreds of billions of liabilities and cash flows in the multiple billions, each of these entities. State capture is that me and my buddies who have some arms, we want to pressure the person who's in control of that entity, because it's not just that he pays our salaries, he can give us privileged access to certain contracts or the ability to smuggle things. And the Libyan state model, probably more so than anywhere on earth, is these different silos of bizarre incentive structures and corrupt opportunities. And that was entirely not reformed when Gaddafi was ousted. So in fact, what worked under Gaddafi was the one powerful guy in charge made the entities all work together. And in his absence, the CBL doesn't work with the government, the NOC doesn't work with GCOL. If you're in control of ODAC, you can just essentially do corrupt construction deals. It's really bifurcated. And that's not even mentioning the bifurcation of the country into two rival institutions.
Okay. And that is Libya, and that's your area of expertise. But the name of your book, which I should have mentioned is published by Oxford University Press, is Libya and the Global Enduring Disorder. How is that relevant to how we see the whole of the world?
Wow, it's relevant in many ways. I feel that I owe the listeners questions 2 and 3 from before.
Please do that first.
Yeah. So coming back to question 2, Gaddafi wanted to impose what he considered imperialism, not only in Africa and the Middle East, but even in Latin America and far-flung parts of Asia. So there was an ideological coherency in his working with the Provisional IRA. He worked with the Sandinistas, he worked with various Kurdish rebels. And I think that we need to give him credit in a way that we can't give credit to Saddam or Assad. He actually put his money where his mouth was, even if it wasn't beneficial to him. In other words, he backed various liberationist groups, even though it hurt Libyan national interests. And then that connects to point 1, which is that the Gaddafi regime was not exclusively or only horrible to its people. Libya was a very poor country when he came to power in 1969, and it did a lot of road building and literacy promotion and all of that. But it was a pure ideological totalitarian dictatorship, more akin to a Stalin and less like a Saddam or an Assad. Mm-hmm. Those kind of societies are very good at, building mega projects like the Great Man-Made River. And they're also very good at repressing free speech and free thought. So we need to judge that legacy in the round.
And then to move on to the idea of how Libya represents, or what it tells us about what the world is now and is turning into. How do you see that?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting to be having this conversation during the US-Israeli-Iran war. I was of the belief in 2018 that Libya was the first test case for what I considered this new historic period, the global enduring disorder. And that's the era after the post-Cold War period, according to my postulation or chronology. Mm-hmm. This enduring disorder has certain key features. The inability of allied countries to coordinate together is a key aspect. And that the failure for the reconstruction in Libya is actually a similar kind of failure to the inability to fight climate change, but a different kind of failure than the failure in the Iraq war. And that's counterintuitive, because a lot of people say, well, isn't Libya just like Iraq? It was another Western intervention. And I would argue not. Iraq was a single-handed, American-led intervention, and it failed because it wasn't needed, the war was illegal, and there weren't, Iraqis who wanted this to happen. Libya was slightly different. The Libyan people did want to overthrow Gaddafi, and they did want to build a new and fresh society. But from the very beginning, it was mired between contradictions that the French had their own motives, the Italians had another, the Americans didn't lead the Western coalition. Sarkozy and Cameron were fighting over how to do things. The Qataris and the Emiratis pulled in different directions. And that this collective action problem is epitomized by what went wrong post-Gaddafi in Libya. And that's the enduring disorder problem, which is that some actors like Russia, but even Trump, they prefer disorder to alternative order. And I consider this unique to our historical period. Obviously, Stalin was a brutal dictator, but he had a vision of order. He had an economy. The Cubans could unwrap a box that says, read your Marx, nationalize the economy, do this, do this, do this. Putin is just trying to disorder Ukraine, and he promoted Brexit because it disorders Europe. He doesn't have an alternative economic model. He doesn't have a vision of how a conquered Kyiv should be run. There's no Putinist economic ideology. He's a disorderer. And I would argue that that's the same with Trump. Trump doesn't have a vision of what Iran should be. He's just happy to disorder to stay in power. Fire Pam Bondi one day, change the generals another day. He's quite different than any other American president. And these unique kind of disordering failings having to do with lack of collective action and active disordering, I believe force played out in their totality in the post-Gaddafi period in Libya.
I'm interested in your theory of disorder, that concept, and it sounds like a negative, or sounds like something that we, the absence of something we have had, and the Cold War, and indeed completely collapsing with the invasion of Ukraine. There was a degree of peace in the world, particularly the Western world, that was unusual in history. And if you go before World War II, obviously there was World War I only 20 years prior, but before that, there was basically sporadic wars everywhere, every once in a while. And the nuclear threat and the Cold War, I think, perhaps put a lid on a lot of that. And that meant that maybe you and I grew up in an artificially peaceful situation. Perhaps that has just decayed back to the status quo ante. Is that possible?
I think that's a very good analysis. And the period 1946 to 2003 was extremely unique, not only in its peace, but in its economic growth. But I would also argue in its ordering tendencies. The Soviet bloc and the American-led bloc sought further and further economic and social integration and tended towards codifying order and systems of order. The UN, the IMF, the World Bank. Bizarrely, when the Soviet Union is defeated, no new institutions of order are created. We don't have post-Cold War global institutions, say a new kind...
In the way that we had post-World War II institutions.
100%. A new kind of NATO or a new kind of World Bank, which was about bringing the Soviet countries into the global economic system. We don't have that. And it happened helter-skelter. The only thing that we have, which can be said to be a post-Cold War treaty, is the Budapest Memorandum. And that guarantees Ukrainian territorial integrity, Ukrainian denuclearization, and the sacrosanct nature of Ukrainian borders. And when it was threatened in 2014, Obama did nothing. And when it was outright violated in 2022, neither the US or UK, who are signatories of the Budapest Memorandum, did anything to enforce its provisions. So the post-Cold War period is not like the Cold War period in having a robust international legal and institutional framework. And I think that that is part of the reason that we have gone off the rails. And I don't think it's just that the Cold War was an aberration in history. It was that it had very special institutions, and it had an ordering ideology which tended towards a greater delegation from the sovereign country to the international level. And international institutions don't function. And people like not only Trump and Putin, but even European leaders are like, well, we don't care about working with the EU on this issue. We're just going to do what we think is our interests. And that really tends towards coordination failures and conflict.
I'm struggling to remember the word in Russian, but I have mentioned on this podcast before the incident where Hillary Clinton, I think, went to Moscow with some little get-up of a thing that had the word in Russian, or what they thought was the word in Russian, for reset. And they wanted, under Obama, post-2008, to reset the relations. And they thought that this charm offensive to Putin could make him see the light and make him stop violating international norms. That was profoundly naive. The naivety of that, we're living with the consequences of that, aren't we?
I love that you've seized on that moment because so my Disorder podcast is 3 seasons in. We've done 300 episodes, but it starts dealing with this exact episode. I speak to the then Undersecretary General of NATO about the failings of incorporating a post Soviet Russia into the global order. We speak also to Anne Applebaum and Jonathan Powell about that moment. And these are people who were working on that. I believe that they thought that they could appease Putin, Neville Chamberlain style, and then he would be nice and play nice with them, rather than creating a robust legal order. If you do X, the punishment will be Y. If you violate this, you'll have sanctions against you. Of course, by not creating, real carrots and sticks, they looted the Russian economy.
Who are they?
The oligarchs and Putin and his friends.
Yeah.
They engaged in every sort of corruption, and they really corrupted our politics. The most popular guest on my podcast is Bill Browder. We've had him on 4 times. He shows how the looting of the Russian state and the stashing of its money corruptly in our jurisdictions. Ireland is one such place, but
Yep.
K and all the crown dependencies, Jersey, Guernsey, BVI, all, Cayman Islands, all of that.
Yep.
That's not peripheral to how the 2000s and 2010s have played out. It's really, really central. It's led to the rise of wealth inequality, the decrease in taxation, and also Russian aggressiveness, which has not only led to the Ukraine war, but it connects back to places like Libya and Syria. The Russians have not proposed alternative orders for those places. They've just been very happy for them to stay in disorder and be a thumb in the eye of the West. And all of this mistake could have been prevented. And that reset meeting, talk about in some of the early episodes of Disorder, State Department Russia experts briefed Obama and Hillary against doing that. They said, this isn't going to work. They're going to see this as Western weakness. You're backing off what we had said we would do earlier. And they were like, oh, no, but Putin is a good guy. We just need to negotiate with him. There's the great line from George W. Bush. I looked into Putin's eyes and I saw his soul.
The one thing that strikes me about what you say there is how we, and you are American if you're not living there anymore, but about how we could have had a rules-based global order and so forth. Can you see how, from someone who might be sympathetic to Putin or someone who is simply not particularly sympathetic to the American world order without being sympathetic to Putin, can you see how they would say, who in the hell do the Americans think that they are saying that they can enforce rules? They're pretty slight on enforcing the rules on themselves.
Of course, I'm very well aware of this argument. And this is the argument against any hegemonic ordering. And sitting in Ireland, you could say, well, the British said that they were promoting order, from Napoleon until the Easter Rebellion, but that order wasn't any good for us. So, of course, I would argue that the American-led post-World War II order was supposed to differ from previous hegemonic orders in that it was collaborative. It wasn't merely about American dominance, but it was about a coalition, not only of the NATO allies, but of our allies in democracies in Latin America and East Asia and increasingly in Africa and elsewhere. Of course, there was hypocrisy and there were CIA interventions in Latin America and the Middle East and elsewhere where people were killed and corrupt elites were.
You might be understating it there because you have, for example, both currently in Iran and previously in Iraq, weapons of mass destruction and repression of the civilian population given as excuses for starting enormous wars, where allies of the US, such as Saudi Arabia and Israel, have weapons of mass destruction. Israel has nuclear weapons. Saudi Arabia is an unbelievably repressive state, and they get a pass. People are perfectly reasonably observing that there is no correlation between those two things, having weapons of mass destruction and repressing your population. There's no correlation between that and being at the sharp end of American intervention.
100%. And there's been hypocrisy at the core of the American system, pretty much always, certainly from Nixon onward. I'm not a fan of American foreign policy, and I left the country to live abroad. So I'm not defending American foreign policy. I just like to live in a more ordered world. That there was an opportunity post 1989 to create a more consensual global rules-based order in which not only Ireland, but Zambia and Australia and South Korea and elsewhere would be participating in this rules-based order, and we would be pushing together to handle challenges like AI and climate change. And bizarrely, we haven't. So I'll just interject a point about Epstein. I think that the intelligence services were not only working with Epstein, but the law enforcement officers in the US, UK, Norway, some East Asian countries were well aware of what he was doing, but decided to never coordinate together to stop it. And that's really indicative. We have all these major challenges, from tax avoidance to climate change.
Yeah.
These are global challenges. If we're not willing to work together, it's not a question of an American-led working together or a non-American-led working together. We've got to work together, or we're hurtling towards doom, whether it's the singularity of an AI that takes over the world or just a climate implosion.
And do I understand correctly that you're clearly talking about disorder? Your view of order is international cooperation that tackles those issues more successfully because it is internationally coordinated?
100%. I would love to see something like a forum of democracies where they have a trading bloc amongst themselves, and it incentivizes countries to pass certain democratic and free speech and non-repressive hurdles to join the club. And if a country like America all of a sudden is not passing those hurdles, it can be kicked out. Obviously, that's so far from where we're at in our world, it sounds like fantasy.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it does.
When we analyze the global enduring disorder and what's wrong, I think we need to understand where we could be at. Otherwise, we're never going to get there. I'll use another example. There are some aspects of the EU that are broken, but I really like the EU as a concept. Absolutely no reason why European diplomacy couldn't have proposed a hostage swap for the ending of the Gaza war a year or 2 years before Witkoff did it. And in a way which would have been more favorable to Palestinian civilians and Palestinian human rights. It simply wasn't done. You could say, well, the EU doesn't work that way, or the EU doesn't have the levers. And that's wrong. The EU is a much larger trading partner, both of the Palestinians and of Israel, than the Americans are. They never use those levers. The EU hasn't been spending on defense. They are more so now, but they could have achieved various negotiations in Ukraine. They just didn't. Therefore, the ground was ceded to America. And I'm not deifying the EU here, right? If you want to be small-minded and say, oh, well, we can't do this, you can't do it because you haven't been doing it.
Yeah.
If European countries wanted to coordinate the gap between France and Italy on the Libya file post-2011, we might not be in the mess that we were in. People forget that France and Italy were on opposite sides of a hot war in Libya the first time that major European allies were fighting each other since World War II. That's, to my mind, unacceptable, and it's a solvable problem.
Yeah. I want to, because I know that you're an Arabic speaker and that you have lived in several of these countries, and I want you to tell me about, very briefly, their view, number one, and whether you think it's justified or not, because a certain segment of population in the West will echo and will have that view promoted very much by Putin apologists, and they will focus on particular failings in the West, including the failings of American foreign policy that you've mentioned, down to freedom of speech issues in Britain, and they will use those to answer the repressive nature of, for example, Russia, both at home and abroad. Do you think, number one, that the quantum of that justifies the comparison? And number two, how do people, particularly in the Arab world, answer that question? So when, for example, J.D. Vance says and talks about completely misquoting figures about the UK online offences bill, and which probably is overstepping anything that a democracy should be doing, but then says that that is worse than the repression of free speech in Russia. A, do people on what is called the Arab Street buy that? And B, to what extent do you think they're correct in their analysis?
I'll take them in reverse order. No, I don't think anyone buys that other than Russian trolls. But yes, we're in a huge culture war, and the culture war confuses everything. About the Arab Street, of course, given the Palestinian issue and the brazen illegalities of American and Israeli military campaigns, of course, people are fed up and that they look at America as being hypocritical, with good reason. And the Trump administration is unbelievably hypocritical, right? I mean, it said it was going to be isolationist, and now they've started these crazy wars. However, I think if you would talk to Libyans, which is a very pro-American place, where would you like to study abroad? Where would you like to move your family? America will be the top destination, more than European countries, and even among people who are anti-Trump, even given the situation now. I have Libyan friends who support Trump, even though they know that it makes it impossible for them to get a visa to do their engineering or other studies in the U.S. But Hammam, you wanted to do your master's at the Colorado School of Mines. Yeah, but I understand why they have to block me from doing it. I still like America. So the Arab Street is a complicated thing, and it's important to not overgeneralize. People can be really unhappy with American foreign policy, and why are the Israelis invading sovereign territory in Lebanon? But if given the chance to study in Boston or even in Tel Aviv, they would take the opportunity. So I think that's a really important thing, that even as our societies are failing, people are aware that they don't want to move to Russia or Uzbekistan. They'd like to leave Syria and move to Britain or America. And we need to have more cultural confidence in ourselves, that we can walk and chew bubblegum, and that we can nuance and improve the injustices and hypocrisies of our society while still sticking to the core values of our democracies and our sense of economy and progress and technology and all of that. And I want to defend, the real core of what the West is about, rather than the nonsense that we sadly have as a result of Trump now.
Jason Pack, the presenter of the Disorder podcast, also the author of Libya and Global Enduring Disorder, published by the Oxford University Press. Thank you very much for talking to me.
Great being here with you.
Never miss a show. Follow at Here's How Podcast on Twitter and like Here's How on Facebook for updates on each show's contents.
Go to the website for sources and references from the show. And while you're there, you can like the show on Facebook, follow the show on X, Twitter, at Here's How Podcast, and follow Jason Pack at Jason Pack Libya, and get in touch if you want to suggest a guest or a topic for a future show. Thanks to all of the patrons on Patreon. It covers the cost of keeping the podcast going, and if you could throw in a couple of euro once or twice a month, please do go and sign up at patreon.com/here's how. That link is on the website. Also there you can find out how to subscribe to the podcast for free on your computer, on your phone, or by email. All that information is at www.here'show.ie. The Here's How podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. The co-producer is Kevin Wolf. Thank you for listening.